Welcome, everyone. This is Terry DeVoe, the Associate Deputy Director for the Grants to States program. We are so happy you're here joining us for the week before the Grants to States Conference orientation. We do this so that people get a sense of some of the systems and acronyms and processes that we're going to be kind of going through at a lightning pace during the conference itself. And if you have any questions, in the lead up to the conference, this is a great place to ask those as well. If you are coming in person next week, I'll just give a couple of shout outs. We've got a very brief intro section at 8:45 on the first day on Wednesday. And that's just a quick meet and greet if you haven't put eyes on those of us that work at IMLS yet. So a couple of us will be doing virtual monitoring and won't be there, but Madison and Dennis and I will be there. And we'd be happy to see you in person for that little 15 minutes before the conference officially starts. And we have it on the agenda now, but that is going to be on the same level as the ballroom in our conference on the 5th floor, and it's going to be in the Oak Room. So it shouldn't be too hard to find, and we look forward to possibly seeing you there. So getting into the presentation content, today we're going to talk through some of our history of how Grants to States came to be, some acronyms, our resources, of which there are many, our systems, and some of the requirements that come with this federal funding program. We also have built in, it says a quiz at the bottom, but don't be alarmed. It's really just a number of questions that we've built in to help you solidify this learning. And we find that this is a better way for you to retain it. And we also have a companion handout that accompanies this presentation, which is a digest. It's a little shorter than printing out the entire set of slides. So we're going to share the handout link at some point in the chat for you. And then at the end, we do have these slides linked online already, and we're going to share that link with you as well at the end of the presentation. So again, we have plenty of time for your questions. So as they come up, just feel free to chat them in. But I want you to know who we are and who's going to be speaking to you today. And that is the 5 of us from Grants to States at IMLS. We have 3 program officers in the middle. They are assigned to states, so you should have a direct connection to one of them. And if you don't know who that is, it's no problem. You can chat it in and we'll make sure to point you to the right program officer. You just have to tell us which state or territory you're from. So that's Madison, Dennis, and Cindy, and you're going to hear from all of them today. And then I support all the states as a team lead, and Laura McKenzie also supports all the states in her program specialist role. And I want to particularly thank Laura for pulling this presentation together. She is the connective tissue for so much of what we do. And I was going to also mention before I go too far along that if you want to meet with your program officer at the conference and you're coming in person to Milwaukee, we have something we call office hours. That sounds maybe a little intimidating, but it's another chance to just get some dedicated one-on-one time with your program officer, and they come in 15-minute slots. So we've still got some of those slots available on the first night of the program, Wednesday, and then on the morning of the second day, Thursday. So now I'm going to, again, thank Laura, turn it over to Laura. Laura's going to kick us off, and here we go.
Thank you so much, Terry. It's wonderful to see all of you here and a lot of new names as well. So I just wanted to get us started with a brief history of the Grants to States program. It's a little bit hard to see here on the map, but it really shows the need. This is a percent of the total population without public library service by state for 1953. And on a related note, here we have a history of library formula funds. This goes back to 1956 with the passage of the Library Services Act, LSA, which authorized 7.5 million annually for 5 years for the extension and improvement of public library service in rural areas. In 1962, LSA was reauthorized as the Library Services and Construction Act, LSCA, removing restrictions that limited funding to rural libraries and adding Title II, which contained funds for remodeling or construction of library buildings. Then in 1996, Congress shifted LSCA to the Library Services and Technology Act, LSTA, as Subchapter 2 of the Museum and Library Services Act, ending federal funding for library construction and replacing it with a focus on new information technologies. Here we get into a lot of content about our common acronyms and terms, and there's a more comprehensive link on our website, which is on the bottom of this slide. So I encourage you to take a look at that. But we will start off here with the SPR, State Program Report, which is also linked here in the slide. IMLS's grants management system is EGMS. Reach is the messaging system used in EGMS. Login.gov is a secure sign-in service that you need to access EGMS Reach, and this has been in place since January 2023. And as many of you probably know, the federal government requires a business, in this case, the SLAA, to have a unique entity ID or UEI, a lot of acronyms here, alphabet soup, through the Federal System for Award Management, SAM.gov. And it's important to note that you should already be an active registrant in SAM.gov, and the GSA, or General Service Administration, assigned a UEI to you, and it will also be viewable within SAM.gov. And IMLS assigns the Federal Award Identification Number, or FAIN, which you can also find in EGMS, and the EIN, the Employer Identification Number. And as I mentioned, yes, please do check out the link here with even more information. And there's the next slide continues with these acronyms and terms, kicking off with the ACO, Authorized Certifying Official. For most cases, it will be the state librarian, but it could also be the administrator that the state librarian reports to. The CFR is Code of Federal Regulations. FFATA is the Federal Funding, Accountability, and Transparency Act, and FSRS.gov is the FFATA State Reporting System. And this is used to enter information on subrecipients who received grants of $30,000 or more. And here we're calling out some really important IMLS financial requirements, match and MOE. Match is the amount of money, 34% of the program budget. Our LSTA legislation requires a state library to contribute toward the grant program using non-federal funds. MOE, maintenance of effort. This is a statutory requirement for states to maintain their financial contributions to the Grants to States program at not less than the amount of the average contributions over 3 fiscal years. If you need to hear that again, don't fear. Match and MOE will be covered in the Financial Bootcamp conference session next Thursday. And finally here, we did want to mention the CARES Act and ARPA because there will also be, I wanted to put in a special plug here for our Office of Research and Evaluation colleagues. There's a session on CARES Act and ARPA evaluation findings on Wednesday morning. And this is a really key resource here for our program, the Grants to States Manual. It's on the IMLS website, and we've included a direct URL at the bottom of this slide. And in addition to the sections visible on the screen, such as state allotment tables, there are sections on a great number of things: the award cycle calendar, financial requirements, financial and reporting requirements, documents, including the state program report, site visits, IMLS guidance, statutes, links to presentations, conferences, forms. We recommend bookmarking this site for future reference. And here we have the site visit checklist, which is another really important program resource. You can access it in the account management section of the SPR, which is called out here on the screen. And it can also be saved as a PDF for record keeping. The questions were updated in 2023, and the entire checklist is web-based, which is an exciting development that hopefully makes it easier for you to complete the checklist. And all requested documentation materials can be uploaded within the checklist rather than emailing attachments, which is handy. And we've also included a reference copy of all the questions here on the Grants to States Manual. Another resource we wanted to call out, and you might be familiar with, is the LSTAC listserv. This is a really great forum designed by and for LSTA coordinators, to ask questions about reports and a whole host of topics. We would encourage that you subscribe, and included information on how to subscribe here on this slide. Now we're going to review a bit about the different forms of communications that we use here, starting with emails from IMLS. Once we receive a message from the state library that a new LSTA coordinator has started, we will send a welcome message and let them know who their program officer is and where to find information. Your IMLS program officer is a key contact for all official interpretation of program legislative requirements and questions. And as Terry mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we're happy to point you to your program officer if you don't know who they are. And once IMLS, we have your name, we have your contact information, we will add you to the state program report system and EGMS system. And your program officer will also let you know who your mentor will be. The mentors are drawn from a voluntary group of experienced coordinators. This way you will have some great resources and experienced people to draw from for questions, and we really appreciate all of our mentors. Another category we wanted to call out here with communications is EGMS. Here's a screenshot of the system. It's our electronic grants management system and should be used for all record level correspondence and payment requests. And we also created a chart to help navigate you through when you should use EGMS versus regular email, because they're different things that we want to see used for each category. And something to call out here too is that EGMS for equipment requests, this applies for items that cost $5,000 or more, which will be changing to $10,000, but there will be more on that later. And with that, I will pass it over to Dennis.
Thank you, Laura. I am going to go over some of the finer details of the state program report. I would say between EGMS, like Laura just referenced, and the SPR, those are probably the two main systems that we use with the Grants to States program. So we thought we'd provide a introductory overview and as is the theme with most of the orientation content, we'll be diving into this more deeply next week, and there'll be plenty of time to go into it in a little more detail and to answer any specific questions in person too, if that's what you prefer. But as I mentioned, the State Program Report, or SPR, is a complete web-based system, and it's our system of record for submitting, reviewing, and approving all of your final reports, both financial and the narrative side of it as well. And so what we do is when we know that somebody new has come on board, we set you up in the system. We give you a username and a temporary password. And then based on your current state's situation, we will you'll have different permissions and different access to different parts of the system based on your identified kind of permissions level. We wanted to let you all know that Chrome and Edge are the recommended browsers for the SPR because it is web-based. That is important. Those are what we find to be the most reliable browsers for working in the SPR. And we also recommend, and this is a lesson learned through much heartache that we want you all to avoid, is to not open two browser windows or tabs in the SPR at the same time. Because this is how you are collecting data and how we are getting the report data. If you have two browser windows or tabs open at the same time, there sometimes is an issue with the data saving because it doesn't know where to save the information. So we just want to recommend keep it in one tab at a time to prevent any data loss, which would be very sad. And then there's also a lot of printing to PDF functionality in the SPR that we have found is helpful for viewing previous reports concurrently with the current one, which if you are new in the role, looking back on previous reports can be a really helpful context. And so what is nice about this report is that you can toggle back and look at previous years and see what was reported previously to kind of get your feet wet a little bit. So I mentioned getting set up in the SPR. The way that we know if somebody has come on board at a state library is that we are notified when this section of the SPR has been updated. So what we always recommend, whether you are representing a new person in your state library or you are the new person at the state library, we recommend going into the state info section and reviewing the various contact fields that you see here and making sure everything's up to date. And as soon as you hit save, we get an email saying that it's been updated. And as you can see at the top of this particular screenshot, there's an indicator of when it was modified last. So we know, and you know, whether or not the information's up to date. So if you haven't done that yet, I recommend just going through, making sure that all of the fields, even if your field is accurate, just making sure that the other position areas and the contact areas are up to date also. And I mentioned earlier how there are different user roles in the SPR, and this is very relevant, especially if you are wondering why you can't see something that you expect to see in the SPR. It might be because you don't have the correct user role in the SPR. That is something that is that we control. So if you do find that you maybe are logging into the SPR, but you can't seem to edit the admin project or something like that, you may not have the LSTA coordinator user role. So you would email one of your program officers or one of us as your program officer and ask to get that switched, and we can make that adjustment. And I just want to emphasize the last two roles down here because they can be helpful for a wide variety of uses. If you are a large state library or maybe a state library that has a lot of projects because of subgrants or things like that, you can add a user that's there just to do project data entry. So they really wouldn't be able to do a lot of editing in the financial side of things or add subrecipients or validate the reports. They would just be there to do some data entry. That's an option. And then for those of you that are overseeing your state library's financials or working in any way, making sure that you're in the SPR and also have that financial manager or fiscal officer user role to help with verifying and potentially adding the data related to the financial reports and the financials under the rest of the projects also. And so, yes, so I went through all of that on the SPR. And like I said, this is intended to be sort of a flyby skim over, and we'll go over more of it next week. But until then, and as a reference, we just wanted to spotlight these 3 links. And these are all derived from our Grants to States manual. So if you hear us referencing the Grants to States manual often, there's a reason, because it is a very comprehensive sort of index of all of these sorts of pieces of support documentation. And these 3 in particular are very helpful for navigating the SPR. The overview and guide is, as it says in the description here on the slide, it does offer a full picture of the process, the technical elements like logging in, but then some of the reporting concepts or how we expect to see certain things reported. And just basically how to use the system itself is the general thrust of that one. And then if you wanted to get more into the data elements, why we're asking for this metric or what we mean by certain terms, the state program reporting requirements is helpful. And then the reporting system user documentation is a very detailed guide in the event that you need to maybe look at the glossary or again, some of the back end technical elements of how the SPR is laid out. Another useful tool that is also on the Grants to States manual is the grant cycle calendar. We don't have a link on it here, but as I said, a link in the chat to the manual will take you there if you go into the relevant area. And we find that this is very popular and very helpful. And quite maybe we don't have the official data on this, but it might be the most printed element of the Grants to States manual for a good reason. I have seen it on many a cubicle wall, and rightfully so, because there are a lot of dates. And if you're not already familiar, our grants overlap. And so this attempts to, through color coding, indicate where you're at and what grant award is relevant to all of these particular deadlines. So we highly recommend that as a getting started sort of reference. And speaking of overlapping timelines, we trot out this timeline visual as often as we can. You can't get enough of it, and no amount of seeing it will help you remember exactly how it works. So we're always ready to show it again. And so this attempts to visualize several overlapping elements related to the Grants to States awards. And so I won't get into it into too much detail, but very loosely, the gray section at the top, it's all colored in gray to demonstrate for you all the grant awards that are tied to a specific 5-year plan period. See that big arrow shows you the 5-year plan period. And because of our timelines and the time you get the award compared to the time the award is finished, the award themselves actually go a little bit further past the 5-year plan period, which is what you're seeing here. And then that orange section to the bottom indicates a new 5-year plan period. And also underneath of those, it shows you sort of how the awards we give to you cascade on an annual basis. So that's kind of visualizing how you get a new award every year, but you have 2 years to spend it. So inevitably, you're going to have this demonstration of the overlap. And then that thick, that more richly colored box at the end of all of those shows you how there's time between the end of the grants period of performance and the time you have to get the report content, narrative, and financials ready for submission to the SPR. So I'm sure there's plenty to mentally unpack here, and we'll have plenty of time next week. and at any time in an email to answer any questions. But that is our attempt to visualize it for you. And now I'm going to pass it over to Cindy.
Thanks, Dennis. We're going to dive into the quarterly grant accrual amounts, or QGARs, as we like to call them. Every 3 months, IMLS needs you to report on grant accrual amounts for the Grants to States program. IMLS developed this worksheet because there isn't an official federal form for the QGARs. Each quarter's accrual must represent the total expenses for active grant awards that a grantee has incurred during the grant period, but has not yet submitted to IMLS for reimbursement. Because 2 federal fiscal years typically overlap in their grant periods, quarterly accrual information will cover those 2 separate active grants. You should send the grant numbers or number and total grant accrual amounts or amount for the current award year or years in the body of the email to, I'm not going to read that off for you because it's on the screen. Submit this information no later than 4 business days after the last day of the quarter, which is also noted in the grant cycle calendar. And here are some reminders about LSTA allowable costs. There will be a very detailed dedicated conference session on allowable costs next week, but this is a tip sheet for you. All right, here comes the quiz. We're going to test your knowledge, everybody. The first few are going to be around material covered in this session, so feel free to answer using chat. You can use EGMS Reach to do everything except the following. A, manage awards. B, request payments. C, send official grant communications such as prior approval requests for equipment. That is a tongue twister. D, access reporting schedules and previous payment requests. Or E, update your state's personnel information for grants to states. I don't see any answers in the chat. There we go. Jennifer Chilcote, thank you so much. It's a sleep test as well. I'd love some more answers in chat. There we go. Thank you. Now they're rolling in. I love the enthusiasm, Alex. Thank you. And I'm seeing a general consensus. Okay. Great. All right, we're going to move on to the answer. The answer is E. You should submit all personnel changes through the SPR state info option in the account management menu item, not EGMS. Annual reports will also be submitted through the SPR. Very well done, everybody. Question 2, LSTA mentors serve as consultants to assist new coordinators who want guidance with anything related to the LSTA program. True or false? Right. Fantastic. All right, it's true. Mentors help new LSTA coordinators learn how to use the SPR system and how to successfully run the grant program. If you are a new coordinator and you don't know who your mentor is, see me at some point during one of the breaks at the conference or send me an email and we will find out what's going on. All right. Quiz question number 3. The maintenance of effort provision ensures that state library investments aren't simply replaced by federal funds over time. True or false? Love the confidence. Love it. True. A maintenance of effort formula ensures that federal assistance results in an increased level of library-related activity and that a state does not simply replace state dollars with federal dollars over time. This is going to be covered in also great depth during the conference, so stay tuned for that. And at this point, I'm going to pass things over to Madison.
Thank you, Cindy. It's so great to have you all here today. We look forward to meeting you. To those who are going to be with us in person next week. To the new folks, welcome. On to question 4. We're moving on to a different category of questions. Which of these applies to the 4% of your award that can be utilized for SLAA administrative costs? A, it could cover fully or partially the LSTA coordinator position. B, it could cover administrative costs imposed by the state for things like accounting support. C, you are not required to use any of the federal award for administration. Or D, all of these apply. Excellent, excellent. We are seeing some consensus in the chat. And you are correct, D, all of these apply. Everything listed there is able to be used towards the 4% of your award, or you don't have to use the 4% admin. It's up to you. Question 5. LSTA records must be kept for 3 years after the SLAA submits the last expenditure report for that period. True or false? Looks like you guys had to think a little bit on this one. That's correct. It's true. According to 2 CFR 200.334, the entire 5-year package of documents is pertinent to the Grants to States program. So records for all of those years associated with the 5-year period must be kept until 3 years after the last report is submitted. Question 6. A state must submit new legal certification, annual assurances and certifications, 5-year plan assurances, non-construction assurances, and internet safety forms to the program officer, A, with every new award, B, when a new chief officer or authorized official is hired, C, with each new 5-year plan, or D, both B and C. It is D, both B and C. When a new chief officer or authorized official is hired, and with each new 5-year plan, you must submit a new stack of assurances. Note that if you have an interim authorized official, authorized certifying official, you do not need to submit full packets of materials for those folks. In question 7, typically no site visits will be scheduled in 2027 when 5-year evaluations and plans are due. True or false? Yes, Karen, we thought of you, and so that is true. Based on your suggestions, we worked to complete all site visits in 4 years. So that 5th year, no state will have to do their plan and evaluation and do a site visit. So with our final question, if you're having issues related to the IMLS program that might cause bigger headaches later, you should wait to tell IMLS about them until they become real problems. False, you guys are correct. The program is a state-federal partnership. You all are our partners. So we want to help you resolve things before they create much larger problems down the road. So please contact us early and often. We always love to hear from you. All right, I think that concludes the end of our initial orientation. Now we're here for questions. And feel free to unmute if you just want to ask your question as well.
Yeah, because I've been looking at the chat and I do not see any questions that came in during the course of the earlier presentation. So yeah, if you want to just unmute, raise your hand, chat it in. We'll take a few moments here.
I have a question.
Great.
What is the designation 2-year award?
I don't know. It's just kind of our practical, when we issue an award to you, its start date is October 1st of a year and its end date is 2 years later on September 30th. So even though we're issuing you awards annually, each of those awards durations is 2 years. So that was kind of getting back to that lovely little chart that Dennis showed with the orange and the gray, where in any given year, you're going to have a couple of open awards because they each last for 2 years. I see a head nod, like hopefully that got to the crux of your question, Jennifer. Cool. Okay, I'm going to read out a question from the chat, unless Brian, you want to unmute and read it out yourself. Okay. I'm new to state government and I'm the grants coordinator. I will be attending virtually and would like to know if certain parts of next week's conference will be more pertinent and informative for me than others. Or will attending the entire conference during the work hours I'm at work be recommended? So if you are the grants coordinator and that translates to what we would consider to be the LSTA coordinator, then I would say yes, it's all super pertinent to you. And as much as you can attend virtually would be awesome. And if you go beyond your work hours for some reason, because we know there's time zones, we will record sessions and post them after the fact. So you could tune into them a few weeks after the conference, but this is like your bread and butter. We really designed kind of a boot camp this year, like a back to basics, and we think everything is going to be very, very relevant. Okay. Yes, and we know those flavors of job titles and what we call LSTA coordinator don't always align. So yeah, figuring out your role is a great first step. Any other questions? Okay. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the recording. I'm going to thank everyone for attending. And then if you want to hang on, you are welcome to. But for the purposes of our formal recording, I'm going to just shut it down now. One moment.